This week's instructional design presentation presents for you an introduction to the course project in some detail, and it uses the course project context to help you better understand some of the information and examples associated with some of the skills that are going to be addressed on the first written course exam. So I call this exam number 1 review part 1, and next week you will get part 2, which will be the follow-up and also the conclusion of what you need to know and be able to do to succeed on the first written exam. Now, as you know, in this course, we are using a model of instructional design that is grounded in the Dick, Carey, and Carey model presented in the course text. And I will have to say that as I introduce the course project to you, you are going to be assigned a small part of the very first piece of the course project, and that piece addresses the needs and goal identification for your course project. As I also mentioned earlier in the course, the model that we're actually following is a slightly modified design based on the Dick, Carey, and Carey model. And again, for this part of the course project, we are starting at the beginning, which is in the analysis phase, but it's part 1 of the analysis phase. So I just wanted to sort of focus your attention right now on the big picture. Eventually in this course you will learn and apply skills associated with all steps in the design model that you see. But for now, we're starting at the beginning with the very first part of the analysis phase. And as I mentioned, I'm going to use this process of the initial analysis phase to help you learn and apply the skills that are going to be measured on the instruction literacy portion of the first written course exam. Now, up until this point, I've communicated to you about instructional design from a somewhat abstract way, and I've tried to use some design experiences to help you better understand the scope of instructional design. And I've used an analogy about designing a home or a structure in some capacity, and the importance of understanding what the purpose of that structure is going to be, and how that purpose defines pretty much every aspect of the design process when thinking about structure, and then getting into a little more detail about events, instructional events. I use the analogy of planning a dinner party, and how the act of doing that and the decisions that you make in planning a dinner party depend on many factors, one of the primary ones being the purpose of the party. So today, as I present information about kind of literacy skills associated with instruction within the context of the first part of the course project, I want you to always consider that the overall purpose of the instructional experience is going to drive most of the decision making that goes on. So let's start then by having me introduce the project to you in more detail than I have up to this point. And as I mentioned before, I want to use this introduction as sort of a context for presenting to you some information and examples that are sort of constitute instruction literacy. I started this class thinking, first of all, that a lot of the students in the course would be education students, and I'm thrilled that we're more diverse. But I started the course with a context about the Civil War, because I think that the Civil War from an educator perspective, is a really good context for applying some of the really important skills in a class like this, in a design class. Some of those skills involve making good decisions about what you think is important for somebody to learn associated with a particular context, and thinking about how important the Civil War is in the culture of Virginia and how important it is in the social studies education of students in Virginia. I thought, well, that's a really good context for considering what is important to learn about a content area like the Civil War. But after reading all of your profiles, I realized that most of you are not typical K-12 classroom educators and have no aspirations to be such, which again I'm thrilled about. I love the diversity of learners. But I also learned from your profiles that many of you are invested in learning about the arts, at least some aspect of the arts in general, and also many of you have aspirations, at least in some capacity, to be a teacher in the arts. And of course, I define the arts, or I regard the arts, in a very, very broad sense. So not just what might consider to be visual arts. So having considered this, I decided to reframe the overall course context a little bit, and so I want to talk to you briefly about this, because I'm going to focus your attention on the development of some instructional goals and outcomes associated with an aspect of helping somebody learn something about the arts that I think is sort of universally important. But having said this, I want to also point out that if you do not need to focus on the arts as the content or the context of your design project for this class. I'm just using it as sort of a really good example of what I expect from you in the project. You are certainly free to do a more traditional academic content area project if you wish, including helping somebody learn something important about the Civil War. But let's talk a little bit about art, and as I mentioned earlier, something I think is universally important in helping somebody learn something about art. And I'm going to focus on a concept that is very broad and somewhat fuzzy. And I'm doing this on purpose. So I want you to consider something for a minute. Art, of course, is a very, very broad general term. And there are lots of different kinds of art. What I have on the screen here is a picture of Charlie Parker playing the saxophone, a very influential jazz musician from the mid-20th century. One thing about jazz that I find kind of interesting is that it's an art form that, I suppose like many art forms, is somewhat of an acquired taste. But I honestly believe that if people in general had a better understanding of the importance of jazz as a musical art form and its influence on so many different genres of music, including types of music that you might not initially consider to be influenced directly by jazz, it's actually pretty profound. And it took me personally many years to truly appreciate not only the structure of jazz music, but also how important the approach to this style of music is compared to some other approaches. So I think personally appreciating jazz as a very important form of music might be, to me, an important focus on learning more about music as an art form in general. But I don't just feel that way about music. Ballet is a form of dance that I don't regularly choose to appreciate, and I don't regularly choose to include as art experiences in my life. But but there's no denying that when I am part of a ballet performance in terms of as an audience member, I am sometimes just speechless about the power and the beauty behind this particular form of dance. And again, similar to jazz, I think that appreciating ballet is likely important if you're considering the influence that ballet has on so many other forms of dance that you might appreciate more or might participate in more. And so again, it's an art form that I think appreciating it more can help you appreciate and better enjoy other forms of dance. There are many forms of visual art, I'm sure, as you are aware, and appreciating the importance and the art and the craft of different styles of visual art, I think, can help you better appreciate many different types of visual representations that most people, at least in today's society, are sort of presented with regularly. Here's an example of an outsider artist, a person who became a visual artist without any formal training whatsoever. And outsider art is one of those forms of art, particularly in visual art, that I appreciate more and value more the more I learn about what outsider art is, and how the people who are outsider artists use their experiences to inform the way they express themselves visually. Now, like most people in this country, I am inundated regularly with the visual art of photography. And here's an image that some people might, who know more about good photography and good composition, might regard as a picture that has a lot going on and that is visually appealing for some important reasons. Now, good photography is one of those things that I don't know much about, but I definitely think I know when I'm in the presence of it or when I see it. And if I was a photography teacher and I wanted people to better appreciate certain types of photographic representations, or if I was a teacher and I wanted people to ultimately kind of regard their photo taking ability using something like a smartphone, something that's very accessible, I might regard the idea of appreciating good photography as an avenue for helping people actually be more thoughtful and take better photographs. So again, like most forms of art, it's one of those things that I don't know that much about it, but I think I know when I'm in the presence of when it's done well, as sort of characterized by experts. Fashion is another one of those things that I am presented with every day. In fact, I am like most people, I am a victim of fashion art in some ways, because every day I put on clothes. Let me reframe that. Almost every day I put on clothes, and when I do, my clothes were designed by somebody, and I'm always a little bemused by fashion shows sometimes, because I see a lot of fashion statements being made by designers that seem a bit outlandish. Not that anything that Bjork might sport would be outlandish, because she is a statement in and of herself. But one thing that I do know about fashion is that what happens on a runway in Milan eventually has an influence over what I might see in any department store at some point in the future. And having a better appreciation for the nature of design related to fashion is something that might influence, affect, and improve the quality of my life as somebody who makes decisions somewhat regularly related to fashion. Now, I'm somebody who does make decisions more than semi-annually related to something like enjoying wine, good wine, I should say. And if you ever enjoy a really good glass of wine, again, it's like a lot of other things. You may not know that much about wine, about its development process, about the provenance of certain types of wines, but a lot of people, even though they may not know that much about wines, can tell the difference between what might be considered a really good wine and what might be considered not so good a wine. And speaking from personal experience, I believe that appreciating wine and all of the skills it takes to appreciate wine helps me enjoy the kind of the process of consuming it more. So again, like all the other forms of art that I've been presenting, it's appreciating wine is one of those things that makes the receiving of wine into my life more satisfying and enjoyable, because I can appreciate better kind of the characteristics of wine. Okay. Finally, I have a picture of something that relates back to the original goal plan for the project, and that is, here I have some Civil War reenactors. And so far, up to this point, in terms of art-related experiences, I've talked a lot about appreciation, but certainly appreciating the importance of studying the Civil War might be an important goal that a social studies teacher would have. It's one thing to be able to help learners acquire basic skills about an academic area like the Civil War, the dates, the battles, the outcomes, the reasons for the war. But it's a whole nother thing to consider what might be the process of helping somebody appreciate the value of studying more about the Civil War. And I'll speak about this personally. I never cared that much about studying battles, historic battles. I've lived in Virginia now for almost 15 years, and I know that some people have a connection to the Civil War, at least a personal connection to it, in different ways, and it's valued in different ways. But one thing I do know about the conflicts associated with the Civil War and the reasons why the Civil War were fought is that those reasons still have an impact and still have an influence on Virginia culture today and on Virginia society today. And the better I understand that, and the more I appreciate that, the more personally driven I am to want to learn more about it as I grow throughout my life. And I have to say that if I'm a social studies teacher, instilling the value of having somebody want to learn more about a particular social studies topic as they grow in their life, that would be definitely an ultimate goal of mine. And I can say the same thing for some of the other art-related content areas that I presented here as a teacher, an underlying goal that I might want to promote and that I would hope I could promote in any instructional experience is helping learners develop a deeper appreciation for a particular content area so that it influences and affects decisions that they make in their life moving forward associated with that content area. That to me would be sort of the ultimate goal. And so in this class and for this project, I'm going to have you focus on a goal that addresses appreciation. And so I have appreciate blank, and blank is the blank where you fill in the blank. Appreciate photography, appreciate visual arts, appreciate dance, appreciate music, appreciate interior design, appreciate science, appreciate social studies, appreciate math. All of that is going to be the focus, or one of those areas is going to be the focus of your project for this course. And one of the reasons why I chose the concept appreciate is that I want to focus on an important step in the design process, in the instructional design process, and that is being able to operationalize an instructional intention. And what I mean by operationalize is, how do you know when you have something? How do you know when somebody appreciates something? And the reason why that's an important question to answer is that you can't design something instructionally unless you know what it is you want a learner or somebody to be able to do associated with the thing you're trying to teach. Some of you when I asked you to consider what the goal was of something you helped somebody learn how to do, that's one of the first things that you had to do for this class. I asked you to consider that, and many of you used some broad terms like understand. I want students to understand art, or I want students to be able to understand the causes of the Civil War. As a designer, it's hard to design for an understanding, but it's easy to design for the thing you can articulate if you say, well, how do I know they understand this? How do I know somebody understands the causes of the Civil War? I might be able to know that if they can tell me what the causes of the Civil War are, or if they can communicate how the causes of the Civil War have influenced and affected the lives of people who live in their local community today, even today. But again, what a learner is doing is communicating to me something with their writing, with their voice, with a visual presentation, or with all of the above. And it is those things that I can then teach. I can't teach an understanding, but I can teach the skills and the behaviors that would help me know that you understand something. Likewise, it is with appreciate. I can't teach somebody to appreciate something, but I can teach somebody to be able to communicate the reason why something is important. Or I can teach somebody how to make choices in their life based on the appreciation of something. That I can teach because I'm teaching something that is an observable change in behavior. And that leads me to the instructional purpose of this presentation. And the instructional purpose of this presentation addresses what I call instruction literacy. The purpose of the project for this class is to have you design instruction, have you design an instructional experience. And so the rest of this presentation is about some of the fundamental concepts associated with instruction, with what that is. And I'm from this point on, I'm going to be perhaps a little less verbose and definitely faster. And so I want to just remind you that most of the content in this presentation is presented in the course notes, in the course text, and of course you can stop this video at any time, rewind, and go back to anything that I might say quickly that you might want to review. Okay, so Part 1 of the course notes presents information and examples associated with 11 instructional outcomes, and these are all literacy outcomes. They are almost all verbal information outcomes. Just important information that I believe is at the foundation of all the more complex skills you're going to learn in this class, and there's 11 of them that are categorized in the course notes as basic instructional design literacy. Now, I do want to point out, though, that in exam number 1 coming up, you are only going to be responsible for demonstrating skills associated with 6 of these 11. And so, again, you might want to stop this video and record this, or better yet, look on the course website. In the syllabus information area, I will have identified these more clearly in the list of course outcomes. I'll make sure that I highlight the skills that are going to be measured on exam number 1. But here they are. They are the ones that are in the clear black font, not the ones that are in the grayed out italicized font. And so over the next few minutes, I want to just quickly present to you some information and examples associated with the skills that are identified as the ones that you have to be able to do or to demonstrate on the course exam. So let's jump in, and hopefully in this presentation you'll get a better understanding of why these are foundational skills and how important they are as we move forward in the class. Well, the first outcome is super important associated with this class, because I'm having you define the terms learning and instruction. And if you think about it, this course is called Principles of Instructional Design, and yet you sort of take for granted what I mean by the term instruction. And you can't understand instruction until you understand how it influences and affects learning. So for this course, learning is defined as the development of new knowledge, skills, or attitudes resulting from an individual's external interaction with her or his environment. And by environment, I am referring to media, physical elements in the environment that you interact with, and the information that is communicated by those media. That's the environment. It's also the result of internal interactions between new and previously existing knowledge structures in your brain. So learning, again, it's the development of new knowledge, skills, or attitudes, but it results from your interaction with your external environment and your internal knowledge structures. Now, instruction are those external environmental factors. Instruction is anything that is done purposefully to facilitate learning. Instruction involves arranging an environment, the external environment of a learner, to maximize the probability that those learners will acquire specific skills, knowledge, or attitudes. Okay, so let me give you an example of, first of all, learning. So here in this picture we have a child on the left. A child comes into this world with a lot of abilities, skills already kind of hardwired. If you've ever had a child or you're about to have a child, one of the things that is just amazing are to observe some of the sort of instinctual behaviors that already exist within that organism. Watching a child nurse for the first time is just, I mean, it's a religious experience. it floors me to know that you come right out of the oven with certain abilities that you don't need any PowerPoints or formal instruction over. I just think that's just amazing. By the way, I have raised 3 children myself, and I have been witness to the fact that my kids did come out into this world with the ability to already perform certain things. But I can also attest soundly that there are many things that they can't do, that they have to learn how to do. So in this diagram, by the time a child is maybe 6 or 7 years old, most children, not all, but most, have acquired lots of abilities to survive and thrive in the world around them. And one set of abilities might be the ability to actually read written words, interpret the symbols that are in our particular language, defined by our particular culture. And that is a tremendous skill set that most children, as I mentioned, do acquire through formal but mostly informal means, but all through instruction. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So I can tell somebody has learned how to read because I can put a book in front of them and I can observe them reading. And I can observe them moving their eyes and their voice, perhaps making noises if they're reading aloud. But I can also observe that they understand what they're reading, which I guess is reading. I can observe that by doing a little bit of assessment and doing a little bit of probing. But I can only observe their behavior. The fact of the matter is, reading or learning is not a collection of observable events at all. When you learn how to read, or when you learn anything in your life, you have actual physiological changes in your brain, structural changes in your brain. Neurological pathways are redefined whenever you learn anything new. And those neurological pathways are developed and redefined in multiple parts of your brain, not just one. There's not just one nerve cell that grows a new dendrite or a new connector, and all of a sudden you can speak and interpret Greek, or you can remember the name of an actor who was in a movie that you enjoyed last week. When those things happen, when you commit something to memory, or when you commit the processes involved in executing some type of routine, though that is the result of changes in your brain structure in multiple parts of your brain. So really, that's what learning really is, if you want to get right down to it. Learning is the establishment of unique neurological pathways that in most cases connect to other previously existing pathways. That's what learning really is. And if you wanted to be honest, if you wanted to be able to determine whether or not somebody has actually learned anything, what you really could do or should do is dissect specific regions of their brain, identify pre-existing neurological pathway structures, and then after some experience, view the same neurological structures in multiple regions in the brain and identify changes. That is unfortunately a little bit more complex than most teachers can manage within a typical semester. And so even though that really is what learning is, the bottom line is I can only tell that somebody has learned something. I can only observe it. And but that's fine, because as an instructional designer, I can only manipulate and control factors external to the learner. So when a child learns something new, or when a person learns something new, they enter into a collection of experiences. and they emerge on the other side of those experiences with the ability to perform skills that are indicative of them having learned something. So the pieces, the pieces of the environment that you can arrange so that somebody learns something, that is instruction. And in a diagrammatic way, what you see presented on the screen are the pieces of a learner's environment that you can arrange. And again, this is painting with a broad stroke here, but there are components of an introduction, for example, that involve specific types of information and experiences that you would include to maximize the effectiveness of that environment to help somebody learn what you want them to learn. There's the overall learning context, practice feedback, of course, review, opportunities to reflect, scaffolds or support mechanisms, how you communicate within the environment. All of those pieces are all things that you can design, that you can arrange. They're all part of the external environment of the learner. And if they're done well and effectively, then when the learner emerges from those experiences, they have acquired permanently a set of skills that indicate that they learned something. Excuse me. And that applies to something like procedures, like reading, or skills associated with something a little more nebulous, like appreciating something. We'll talk more about that in a moment. And again, so let's talk for just a minute about how to recognize that somebody has learned something. As I mentioned before, you can do it the difficult way, which is a lot of brain biopsies, or you can do it the most obvious way, which is and the easiest way, and really the only practical way. And that is that learning can only be inferred by observing a persistent and permanent change in a person's behavior. Persistent being that you can invoke that behavior, or that behavior can be demonstrated regularly. So it becomes it's a permanent part of the brain structure. That's learning, and again, it can only be observed by observing. I mean, you can only tell somebody learned something by observing. And again, as I mentioned, I can tell somebody has learned how to read when they read, however I operationalize that skill set. I can also tell when they've learned something by biopsying different parts of their brain. It's more, by the way, that's a little more difficult than it sounds. Trust me, because you have to do the tricky part is getting the pre-pictures. That's a little hard to manage. All right, you also need to define the term interaction. And interaction, for our purposes, there are actually two types: external and internal. External interactions represent the degree to which your input or human input influences or affects the messages that are presented in an external environment or with external media. That's what interactions are. And as I mentioned before in our definition of learning, learners learn by interacting with their environment. And so the degree of interaction externally is the degree to which their input affects the messages that are presented. Internal interactions represent changes in cognitive knowledge structures and processes that result from an interchange between new information that you receive via media, be it via external communication devices, and previously existing information or knowledge structures that you already have in your brain. And so that's internal interaction. And again, details about this are presented in the course notes. And as I previously pointed out, within an instructional experience, the degree to which the learner interacts with information in the environment, both internally and externally, is the degree to which they will actually learn something. And if you consider the act of reading and what you interact with here is a really good sort of representation of somebody in the process of learning something through interactions. The child, who I'm presuming is the one on the left who's reading, is excuse me, I must be going on too long because I'm starting to cough. So let's wrap things up here, teacher. So here you see a child interacting with a book, which is a medium. It looks like it's multimedia. It has words and pictures. But the learner, of course, is also interacting with perhaps the most important and the most dynamic and the most the key media in the learning environment, and that would be whoever the woman is on the right. And so it is in those interactions where learning occurs, and it's no coincidence that children who are read to when they're young are children who learn and grow in the area of reading typically more successfully in their earlier years, and it's not just the modeling that's going on when a child is read to, or when a child gets to read to somebody. It's the interaction that goes on between the child and the instruction giver. The instruction giver being the experiences of the book, and also the experiences and interactions with another human. Perhaps the most important, the most valuable, and without question the most interactive medium in a learning environment. Now, speaking of medium, let's talk about instructional media for a moment. First of all, media is just the plural of medium. And a medium is a physical element in the environment that communicates messages. Physical element. If you think about it, just about anything physical in your environment is capable of communicating a message. If it has a message, a visual message inscribed on it, or if it can project visuals or audio. So anything can be a medium. A model of something could certainly be a medium. It can communicate messages. But they're instructional. They're considered instructional when they're actually used to communicate messages within an instructional environment. So that's what an instructional medium is. In the case of the child interacting with with another person as they are in the process of learning how to read, as I mentioned earlier, the book itself is a medium, an important one certainly, but so is of course the person that you're interacting with. Very important. That person is capable of communicating lots of messages, both verbal and nonverbal. If you take a look at I'm assuming that's the mother, but I could be wrong. It could be the teacher, a teacher. But you look, there's eye contact, there's smiles. There are so many subtle messages being communicated by that medium that have a profound impact on how those messages are received by the student and by the learner. And of course the learner is interacting because the learner, the learner's input affects what messages come out of that particular person. Notice that the medium that down on the table there, or on the floor, that medium, the book, is much less interactive. Learner input can not affect what messages are presented much at all, other than turning the page. It's about that. So that's a very low interactive medium, and of course the person would be very high interactive medium. All right, let's talk about instructional context then. You need to define that. This is super important, something that you're going to be addressing in the course project quite a bit. Instructional context represents all the factors that are external to learners within an instructional environment that provide meaning for the messages they receive. Those are the factors that influence and define what, when, where, how, why, and with whom individual learners learn from instruction. And I will tell you right now, the biggest reason why I had to revise the instructional design model presented in Dick and Carey is that they don't do an adequate job at all of having the designers focus on the overall instructional context. Now, they do use the word context in the analysis phase at the very beginning of the model, but they don't use it in the same context that I'm using it in. How's that for confusing? I use context, which, by the way, is something that the designer has a lot of control over. I use context to describe all those factors that define what, when, where, how, why, and with whom a learner will be expected to learn something. And it's something that is inherent in all instructional experiences. Everything has a context. It's just that I want you to identify and define context that can provide meaning and purpose to learning something. Now, let me just give you an example of the importance and the power of context here. As a teacher in higher education, one of the things that never ceases to amaze me, never, is that a university will receive an international student, somebody from another country, whose first language is not English. And although formally English language skills need to be communicated and performed at some level in order to get into most American universities, I have more often than not met students from other countries whose first language is not English, and when they arrive for their graduate studies from another country, excuse me, their actual literacy in English skills are lower than they want them to be, and there's a lot of it's a new experience. And what amazes me is that within a relatively short amount of time, a year or 2 years, I can observe these non-native English speaking people acquire a tremendous grasp of the English language, a great proficiency at being able to communicate in English and understand in English. And I am floored. And the reason why it floors me is that I had 4 years of Spanish instruction in high school, 4 years, and then I had a semester in college because I had to take some. And there's almost nothing that I have as a permanent part of my language structure associated with Spanish. I know a handful of terminology. And I know a few sentences, como está usted, things like that. But the reality is, you couldn't drop me in the middle of Mexico City and have me really understand when somebody's talking to me what they're saying exactly, unless they slow down. I'm much better at trying to figure out some of the words in something written. But that's not what amazes me about international students here in America. What amazes me is that I can have an office hour visit, and like I said, on day one of arrival, I'm communicating with a person who really struggles understanding what I'm saying, and then by a year later, only 1 year later, it's a whole different experience. Why? I think it's because of context. Because learning the skills of English at every step of the way for somebody who's immersed in the culture where that language has currency, every day they get practice and feedback for a purpose, for a reason. The reason is survival. The reason is to try to make the best of your situation, like any form of communication. The reason why it's so ineffective in high school is that there's no reason or purpose for me having to learn Spanish other than I want to pass the Friday quiz. That's it. And so context is of supreme importance. It has a profound impact on the effectiveness of an instructional experience. Let me give you another example that might be closer to home if you don't happen to be an international student, and that would be sort of technology, the technology world that we're living in. You may not be old enough to remember the first time you got a smartphone or the first time that you got a tablet computing device. But what I find really interesting about these devices is that they don't come with a lot of instructions or user manuals the way computing devices used to come with in the past. Excuse me. Part of that is because they're a lot more intuitive, but the other part is that in order to figure out this device, this is a communication device now, these devices. And in order to get what you want, in order to accomplish what you want to accomplish of these devices, you have to figure some stuff out. So it's a lot of practice and feedback, but it's not like you're sitting down studying it. It's practice, and it's practice with a purpose. And so the act of learning how to use one of these devices is something that is more organic and defined by the fact that you feel as if you need to figure this out. You need to use it. You need to learn it. You know, similar to learning a language. And in some cases, using technology is like learning a new language. But it's the context of needing to use it for a purpose. If you were to go to training on using a computing device like we used to do back in the early days of computers, there were classes on how to use a computer. I had to literally teach people step by step how to save files. Gosh, well, I suppose now even saving files is sort of somewhat academic. And by the way, I still need to teach people specifically how to find files that they have apparently saved somewhere, but that's another ball of wax. But the point is, the effectiveness of instruction is formal or informal, is defined heavily by the meaning and the purpose of learning, of needing to learn something to begin with. Now I'm going to end this presentation by one last thing, by having you need to describe factors that affect how individuals learn from any instructional experience. Again, formal or informal. And the reason why this is an important skill for you to learn is that you are going to be asked in this class to define or design external factors within an experience that will maximize the probability that somebody learns what you want them to learn. And in this case, they're going to be learning something associated with that, something that will influence and affect their attitudes. And so it's really important to consider, okay, well, what do you have control over as a designer? You probably already know this, but let's just talk about it. Okay. So here are some factors that these are not all the factors that influence and affect how people learn from their environment, but it is some important ones. Now, the first one, cognitive abilities and developmental level of the learner. So the fact of the matter is, you can't teach a toddler certain skills, no matter how many pre-existing pieces, or no matter what their pre-existing knowledge structures are. This, by the way, is a contentious idea, and there is some belief by some that you can teach anybody anything as long as they have enough previous experience in the area. I can give you a lot of studies that would not support that notion. The cognitive abilities are something that seem to be associated with the physical development of your brain. And the fact of the matter is, for most of you, not all of you, and I'm not going to point fingers or name names, but most of you, your brains are physically a lot different now than they were when you were 2 years old. Granted, there's an awful lot of development that happens at that stage physiologically that don't change as dramatically after your head blows up as a toddler. But suffice to say, that's an important characteristic to consider. The other one, of course, previous experiences. That's absolutely crucial and key. Another one are, what are the instructional components and conditions within a context? For example, how much practice and feedback are you getting over a certain skill set? That has a profound impact on whether you learn something or not. The degree of message abstraction. I'm sure all of you probably have had the experience, perhaps you're having it now at some point in this presentation. You have some information presented to you that for you is very abstract. It's not concrete. There aren't enough connections to things that you already understand for you to really be able to clearly grasp what the media is communicating to you. So message abstraction, very important. The perceived relationship that you have between any verbal and visual stimuli, that has a profound impact on how well you learn something. And again, it's up to the designer to influence and affect that, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. The clarity and effectiveness of the messages presented. I suppose that relates somewhat to message abstraction, but it's a little bit different. How many examples are available? How good are those examples? How salient and germane are they to a particular concept? Very important. All right, amount, type, and rate of information presented at any given time. That has a profound impact. This presentation notwithstanding, I am a really, really big proponent of going more slowly when it comes to the presentation of information, the type of examples, the amount of practice. Slow and steady wins the race, absolutely. Amount and type of support mechanisms that are accessible within the learning environment have a profound impact. We call those scaffolds, by the way, and you're going to learn more about those as the semester progresses. So instructional scaffolding is really important. Next, we have the motivational strategies that are integrated into the learning experience. How well did the person who developed the instructional material or the experience, how well did they address trying to motivate you? And motivation can be small, like just doing something to gain your attention. Or it could be something very large, like providing you with an overall context that has meaning to you. I could tell you right now that the course project here, for those of you that are going to go on to be art educators in some way, or if you're a teacher, a K-12 teacher, I can tell you right now that not only will this project help you learn skills that will have a profound impact on your ability to be a more effective educator. The project will do that, but also the skills, the actual skills you're going to learn here aren't necessarily skills that you learn in typical education classes. Certainly not skills that people who teach in higher education ever have to formally learn. That's one of the things that kind of really bothers me about higher education, to be honest with you, is that a lot of educators who are tasked with educating don't have any formal experience helping somebody learn something. They have a lot of experience learning things. Heck, they're very good at it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be at this level. But there's a big difference between being able to learn something well and being able to teach something well. And this class is about the latter. The type and degree of interactions that are possible with the media, that can have an impact on how well you learn something. Any social interactions that are involved. There's no denying that we are social creatures, like it or not. As an introvert, I'm not always pleased with that realization. But the fact is, and the research bears this out, that when you are immersed in a learning experience that involves directly or indirectly interacting with other people, then the learning experience itself is changed in very, very dramatic ways. Also, intrinsic or personal motivation for learning something influences and affects how people learn from an instructional experience, of course. Your personal learning style or your personal preferences, that's a very that can have a profound impact. Learning styles in general, there's no research to suggest that has that matters much in terms of design, but it certainly matters to the learner in some way. Or some ways, I should say. And finally, the overall instructional context, period. that is the, as I'm going to talk about later in this class, I think that has probably one of the biggest impacts. That and the amount of practice with good feedback that you get. Probably the two factors that influence and affect learning the most from any instructional experience. So finally, I want to end this by communicating to you quickly which of these factors that are listed on the screen, which of these factors are external to the learner and are internal to the learner. And the reason why that's important, of course, is that as you design instructional experiences, you can only make design decisions that can manipulate things external to the learner. So those are the things that become the elements of effective instructional experiences from a design perspective. So I'm going to go through these quickly and you can rewind this. Also, as I mentioned before, this is information that's presented in the course note. So let's go through this. Cognitive abilities, that's internal. You can't do anything about that. Maybe help the learners, encourage them to have a good breakfast. I don't know. Previous experiences, again, you can't when you start a learning experience, that's something that is internal to the learner. Of course, as you progress throughout a course, their experiences are shared experiences related to what you provide for them in the course. So of course you can have influence over this, but not at the entree to a new learning experience. The instructional components, obviously that's external to the learners. The degree of message abstraction, well, that can be external. You can do something about that as a designer, but of course that also depends on their cognitive abilities, their experiences, and how they can interpret the level of abstraction. But again, this is definitely something that you can control. Also, the relationship between verbal and visual stimuli in many parts of an instructional experience, that can be both external and internal, again, depending on cognitive abilities and previous experiences. But like message abstraction, it's something that as a designer can definitely influence. The clarity and effectiveness of the messages, that's certainly external. Amount and type of information, that's external. Support mechanisms, the scaffolding, that's external to the learner. Motivational strategies are external to the learner. That is the ones that you can design. Type and degree of interactions, those can be, they are external to the learner completely, and you can influence those as a designer. The type of social interactions are external to the learner. Intrinsic motivation is certainly internal. There are factors associated with motivating learners that you can have some control over externally, but in terms of whether or not that means anything or matters to individuals, that's of course completely up to them. Same with their own learning styles or preferences, that's their own. What you need to do as a designer is just ensure that whatever it is you're trying to communicate to the learners, whatever it is they're interacting with, is the most effective for the type of skill you're trying to facilitate. It doesn't matter what their learning style is. There's nothing that you could or should do differently to accommodate, say, visual learners versus auditory learners. If a skill needs visual support because that's the best way to learn it by anybody, then it needs the visual support. Same with audio. And finally, the overall instructional context, period. That is typically the collection of external factors that influence and affect learning. Okay, so that is it. As we move forward in this class, you're going to be spending a good amount of time focusing on the design aspect of the model, but the design comes from clear analyses, clear definition of a meaningful and purposeful context, and these are all communicated in different steps in the design process. And as I mentioned before, at the heart of this process is the Dick, Carey, and Carey model, but it's been altered and a few steps have been added by me to accommodate some of the really important external factors like instructional context, like the amount and type of scaffolding that you should always consider as a designer. But for now, you're going to focus on the very first step in the analysis process for your course project. And as I indicated earlier, there are 6 outcomes that are going to be measured on exam number 1. There are some other outcomes from part 2 of the course notes that I'm going to be addressing next week. But this week, there are 6 outcomes, and you need to be able to do those well. I'll be providing some practice over those next week as well. But review the notes on it. And it's time now to move on and actually complete the first part of the course project, where you begin the process of analyzing the needs and the initial goal statement.